Word. And yeah, it's already recording. I mean, whenever I enter in some chat Discord, whenever I go on Discord, my assumption is anybody will be recording me, simply because that if you
Yeah.
public, whatever you say
Yeah.
will be used against you, and I kind of just live by that rule.
That's pretty much how people operate. I think you hit the nail on the head on that.
Yeah, I've just
People are always looking for you to say as something that they can, like, they're sniffing like sharks, they're like piranhas in water. Like anything that could possibly be used against you, they're gonna try. So that's why you always have to be confident with what you say. That's why I said earlier, I respect authenticity. I personally don't care what anyone believes. I'm not a political person one way or the next, but if you do choose one side, you have to be confident about it.
Side of what?
Like if you do choose a belief, if you subscribe to whatever belief that you do, you have to be confident about it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess. Well, my beliefs are already, I have my beliefs. It's just whether the rhetoric or how I present myself in the beliefs I do. I mean, accordingly, you're a musician. I don't know. I guess that's what you told me.
Yeah, famous Rockstar musician. I do a lot of live shows and all that shit. But
Well,
as for right now, coronavirus
you're
is.
famous. You're gonna be doxxed. This is it. This is your career.
Well,
This is
I was just having a conversation about that, and I guess that comes with the territory. So bring it on. Fuck it.
I think I've talked to someone. I don't know if it was you or if it was about some months ago. This kid in Minnesota, and he had a shoegaze band, and he basically told me the exact same thing, and said, I don't know, and I think I can look in my Skype. We used to talk on Skype like 3-4 times, and one of my friends, Patrick Lamont, had a Google Hangouts. I think it's on private now, but I enjoyed that conversation with him, and I was always wondering where he is. I think he bought some cassettes from me, and I actually can dox him because I have his information, but I don't do that, so I don't know.
Well, it's like it's just fuck it. It's like I don't even care. Like, I mean, I have too many personalities anyway, so you got to dox like all those personalities that I got.
I wonder if we already talked. Well, I wonder if we already talked before, because there is this individual I remember named, no, I won't say her name, but I don't even know. It's this person on the internet that says she was this kind of Eurasianist type, but then went on this white nationalist website and said she was this, and then all of a sudden changed her name and said he was. Basically, I was on her program like 2-3 times, and somewhere in obscure YouTube land, but everybody in the Discord services from the distributed server and some Catholic Discords I know she's kooky or something. I never understood that. I'm not going to say her name simply because I don't.
Well, I thought, wait, so you personally are not subscribing to a Eurasianist belief? Because I thought
No.
were.
I am the whole Eurasianist boat right away. I mean, I just say it in a different way. I mean, sometimes when I talk about it in the past, people gave me like bad looks about it, but
Fuck them, you know what I mean? Fuck them.
Yeah.
You gotta, just own it. Own whatever you are.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's branding. I mean, I don't know what I've been doing recently. I mean, since now I've graduated school, I'm kind of just rebooting some things such as music and whatnot. And I've been using a term AXA. Yeah, I mean, you said Asian Aryanism before. One thing that I found very subliminal is I kind of do some art, and such art I like to do is, I like to do this thing called AXA and put the second A. We know what the first A is, Asian. And I like to say that the second A is aestheticism, Aryanism is the joke, whatever you want to fill in the blanks. But I always found that AXA had a very similar connotation to straight edge culture. But maybe at this current point in time, if, continue on the Eurasian project, I just have to write more theory books as of right now, because I'm more just trying to focus on more art I'm doing. And I just really haven't made a proper blog post on the Eurasian project recently, simply because of school and other things. But I would like to go back to it. It's just that my intentions are, I want to do a big project, like make a documentary or a short film.
So what is your ethnicity?
It's kind of mixed.
Yeah, I figured.
It's kind of, it's like it's somewhat Eurasian, but it's hard
So,
to,
like, what specifically though? I'm curious.
I mean, I was on Luke Ford. I don't know if you watched Luke Ford, and Luke actually asked me the same thing. I was like, well, my mom's like Pakistan and
Oh, okay.
Japanese, and so technically I'm like a fake token Northeast Asian. I'm like
So you're like, yeah, I can
I'm a
actually relate to
fake.
that. I can, see, I can claim many things because, I mean, I can claim some of that. Like, I have family that comes from Siberia, as you know. Siberia is Eurasia, so I can claim like the Near Eastern people from that region, like the Chechens and the like how you mentioned the Kazakhstan people, but also the smaller groups like the Circassians and the Chechens and all that stuff, which are really cool people. Abkhazians, they have a really interesting culture. They're very warlike people, and it's just interesting because I can claim, because if you come from that region, if you have ancestry in that region, then you basically are like a smorgasbord of different ethnicities, and a lot of genetic diversity comes from that region.
You're probably familiar with the New York City area, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, before the COVID happened, all the way up until I would say late summer, last 6 months, I've just had a group of friends, and I was living in Manhattan, and for that time, and I'm outside of New York City at the moment, but during that time, I would hang with friends like Al Stankard, Harlan Venison, Rachel Haywire, Richie, John P. of Million Dollar Extreme, and we'd just have these kind of outings in the Bushwick area. And Al told me, he's been on Vice before, and Vice written something about him, and he has always these.
Oh, Vice, cool.
Yeah. Oh well, I guess. And
Well,
so
yeah, I understand what you mean. They could easily not be cool. If you piss them off, they could write something really nasty about you.
yeah. Al has a Al has
Well,
a
that's how they are. That's journalism. That's just how they are. That's how they operate.
but the thing about Al is he's really comfortable in some of the political circles, and people ask him all the time, "Where are you? Are you like some kind of Jewish, dark skinned?" And he's not Jewish at all. He just likes
Yeah.
to often charade as this like mixed race individual, but he's probably likely Polish, Irish, mix of French, and probably a little bit of dark skin Arab in there. But he knows kind of the game of just kind of the POC circles and just doing his own thing in a nice leftoid talk, but in a way that's kind of effective to how people think and operate. I don't know, and just in that kind of space. But it's interesting that if we're talking about ethnicity is one thing, but the lingo and language, how people identify themselves, is another thing, and how
Uh-huh.
people can get too caught up when being considered quote unquote white, if that means
Well, see,
anything at
that's the
all.
thing. I was trying to read through, like, I visited your blog even. It stood out to me because there are a lot of, there's a lot of complexities on it, and I'm a very complex individual, so I'm drawn to people that display contradiction. Apparent, what do you call it? What's the word? I can't think of the word. A contradiction in which that's what you want it to be. You want it to be contradiction, or that just may be how you are, but it's not fake. That's what I'm trying to say. So yeah, that's what I was drawn to because I saw all these different writings from like totally different opposite beliefs, and it caught my attention a little bit because you must be a pretty complex individual to think in such a way.
I mean, you can Google search. I mean, I do my books with ISBN numbers, and I believe that Google Books does copy and scans my books. And if you just like Google search, like I believe my book I edited on Robert Stark recently is on there, and some of my older textbooks. Unfortunately, there's still like somebody scalped a first edition of Almond Eyes Babyface and being sold on Amazon, but there's a newer edition on my. Actually, Lulu just revised itself, and my books that were kind of sold on Lulu last 2 weeks ago, because Lulu went through a revision, it's not showing up right now. So I don't know, that has to be fixed or whatnot. But I would suggest you should Google search the queer culture book I wrote last year. That's
Was
an,
that picture of Boyd Rice with someone photographed with Boyd
oh no,
Rice? That wasn't you.
that's Pato. That's Pato is like like one of the first yaoi mangas ever. It's from the 70s. I love it. I mean, if you love Boyd Rice and kind of like cross-dressing David Bowie, Art Nouveau kind
Well,
of.
Boyd Rice is interesting. Boyd Rice is like that's like noise. That's experimental culture.
I'm friends with Whale Song and some of the Boyd Rice, the Partridge Family Temple. You know about the little
Yeah,
Partridge.
yeah,
Not
yeah.
Partridge.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Boyd Rice has his fingers in many different fucking pies because Boyd Rice is a very interesting person as well. He's very. What I'm saying is he's very prominent in hardcore noise experimental scenes. Like he's pretty much the progenitor of that kind of music, which I love, by the way. And he also has done a lot of Partridge Family stuff as well. He's done a lot of really strange things in which it's like kind of all over the place, but he's
Yeah,
intentionally all over the place.
a lot of the Boyd Rice fans are now just members of the Partridge Family Temple, and I kind of echoed that with the whole fast food fascism thing and just embracing, NBC Peacock, CBS logo, and kind of esoteric, like how kind of late stage capitalism is a form of, fascism, or taking in kind of the Milton Glaser-esque iconography. It's a form of that totalitarian. Now it can be transgressive. And I think, Boyd, Shaw, Whale Song are sure, that circle does a great job at it. And I kind of just wish there were more people into that. So, but it's a part of that, cycle. And a lot of that appears in my
What's the
own.
idea? The
Um,
basic idea?
from with Sean Partridge, I think it's his. First of all, it's his love from the past of 1960s, 70s culture. It's also this fascination with like lava lamps, Rubik's cubes,
Right.
kaleidoscopes,
Yeah. The whole
kind
unisex
of,
culture that
and
would
then
come
like
from
with
the
biker
60s.
stuff. It's kind of like Black Magic SS. It's kind of like you're talking about this progressive rock era, but you're also talking about the transgressive before there was any connections to any white nationalism or whatsoever.
Right.
Um, and Boyd seems to just now be a member of Sean Partridge's project, and you make that same connection where Jim Goad became more on the right wing side of things. And I always was an artist. I went to art school, and I always felt more at home with understanding transgressive culture and what it means to have aesthetics in that category, and what does it mean. It's not about the action you do or say, it's what attracts that type of people. It's kind of like a whole consumer thing, but
Well, it comes and goes in different ways. Like for example, I was just actually reading about this, so it's funny you talk about this. But I was basically it comes and goes in different ways because right now it seems like quote someone I'm quoting someone and I agree with what he said. He said something like all the cool kids quote unquote are going towards more the right, all right, alt right, more centered stuff. But in the past, it was totally the opposite, as you know, because you're talking about Boyd Rice. So it comes and goes as the times and economic cultures, as the economic system changes, I suppose. As the economics change, so does the culture. And I think we're experiencing that now, and especially now, actually. But yeah, I've noticed in the past years a whole love and flirtation with the right has definitely been brewing for sure.
well, I think that kind of what I'm seeing is that period, that intersectional far right scene's over. I think a lot of those people who are invested into countercurrents, radix, the right stuff.biz, that kind of the postmodern right project has failed. And I think a lot of them now are scattered brained, and some of them are, I think, becoming Marxist or becoming more into, some of them went to being this fake Catholicism, you know,
Hmm. Yeah,
watch
you see a lot of that
Cliché
as well.
Fuentes, distributism, things like that. And then you have these half that don't want to do anything about it anymore, kind of like joining the porn industry or something. And
No, well, yeah, yeah. Continue.
no, but I see, from my end of the spectrum, I just became more of a Marxist. I think more of that capitalism seems to be the enemy of a lot of woes that people who originally were a part of what you would call the alt-right. I think it's not so much that you have to preserve or fight for, racial survival. It's more of a cause of the system you are under and you have to abolish. And I believe that's capitalism, that makes up so much of our everyday life, and we have to kind of restrain from it, or at least reform it in some way or another. And I think that's slowly operating to some spheres. I mean, I recently checked American Renaissance a few weeks ago, and already they're having articles about the anti-white left, and what else? They talked about a proletariat for a white working class. So obviously, American
Well,
Renaissance.
that's the thing. That's the thing. That's why you can't even. And I knew this from the very beginning, and that's why I'm not a political person at all, because I think it's all just bullshit on the right and on the left. I think it's just. I mean, if that's what someone wants to do, that's their prerogative. But I think the whole thing on the left and the right, it's just become a form of identity, but it's not even really about politics, because I'll tell you what. On the right, for example, um, they're very socialistic. But you say, well, first I want to address the point that you say they don't exist, and I disagree. You just don't know where they are. They're all on 4chan, and believe me, there are tons of them, because I know, because I've been around that scene, and I've also been around the other scenes like the Boyd Rice scene that you're talking about. But most of them, they're all on 4chan, and 4chan is the worst place on the
You mean
surface
the right?
web.
You mean what you would call the right?
What you
Correct.
would call the right, correct?
I mean, this is something I bring up. I mean, so in 2015, at an NPI conference where you had Mike Enoch, Henry Palmerick, Lana Lochtef, and I believe Richard Spencer, they all had a talk about the future of the right. Now, this was before 2016 or the election of Donald Trump or Unite the Right. And what Mike Enoch and Spencer all said was that the right is winning the internet. You go on 4chan and they're there. I'm paraphrasing here, but we shouldn't be basically talking big theory or talking about French New Right thinkers. Instead, we should embrace this kind of postmodern culture war. The problem is that's what destroyed the intellectual vanguard that was early known as the alt-right, and kind of what originally attracted to me to people like Julius Evola or Rene Girard. It's kind of like people like these things for superficial reasons, and when you made the lower common denominator of nerdy stay-at-home individuals, it's not a sincere thing. It's just kind of a transgressive thing. And I believe that co-opting under capitalism and the failure of understanding metapolitics destroys the whole project. As 5 years later from that speech, RightStop.biz is hardly an entity anymore. People don't take Spencer serious anymore. In fact, Spencer had to reform Radix as a critical theory journal, and Countercurrents is there. It's just more of older people and Greg's friends. It's not something that.
No, I understand. I think in terms of economics, it's going, yes, it is going towards what you would call a Marxist um, area or whatever. And that's just the form of government, though. That's just how in Plato's Republic, that's how it happens. It starts at an aristocracy, then a democracy, then an oligarchy, which we were. Then it's becoming ruled by the public, and that's where you get all the identity culture. And eventually, it's just, unless it's pulled off in which to sustain it, it's just going to blow into full-on anarchy, and it'll be brought back by like strong fascism. And I guess that's what a lot of those guys on the right are doing. They embrace the fascism part because they think eventually the whole system's going to crash. So they say, "Fuck it." They identify as a fascist.
Yeah. Well, what I more talk about is, not only this mourning and yearning for this intellectual right wing, intellectualism like Nicholas Gurich Clark or anything like that. I kind of just now stay away from the last 6-7 years of these types who will basically assume My Little Pony has something to do with white nationalism. These are
Oh, yeah,
basically the
that's stupid as
types.
fuck.
Yeah, exactly. Stupid as fuck. You know, I don't like Buttercup
Yeah.
too, by the way, but I find those individuals revolting because that wasn't anything happening in 2011 or 2012 or even in 2007. People were still reading PDF files of Anthony Levici's, you know, philosophy, or Nicholas Gomez Davila, you know, things
Hmm.
obscure figures that people still don't, or even Gene Wolfe, you know. What happened was when the far right or when the alt right branded itself and thought it could be this consumer culture hot topic thing, you got the worst type of people in there. And like you're saying about the 4chan individuals, those very people ruins the entire intellectual vanguard. And now it's kind of a shame to associate with that work. But it was only a decade ago you had works by Jack Donovan talking about the right to be gay and be right wing, or this idea of you know, even like you could say old works of Jim Goad. It was the punk culture was there, but and some of the classic analytical work, but people had been, you know, erased. It still sadly happens, and there's still a niche for it. I mean, I hardly doubt anybody actually listens to the right stuff.biz or the Daily Stormer anymore, or takes Uncuck the Right serious anymore. These individuals are flawed on many areas because I just call it hipster racism, because that's what it really is.
Yeah,
Kind of bothers me.
it is. It is a little bit of that for sure. Um, yeah, I can only comment on these things from an outside observer more so than someone who understands the more like someone who would identify as that culture, because I don't identify as anyone's culture.
Mm.
But what I can say though is that I see the same exact thing on the left though. The whole I can just chalk it up to just postmodern identity culture gone fucking crazy, and then you put in the internet, and that exemplifies it like 100 degrees.
I mean, have you been paying attention to BreadTube, like non-compete, Vosh, re-education? Those types I've been finding very fascinating, because the BreadTube project was to basically make left-wing theory fashionable among common YouTube consumers, and that was Vosh. But then you have two other users like Danky Kang and Leftism Today. You know, they'll go up to Vosh and say, Vosh, you don't know anything about Marxist theory or like orthodox Marxism, and you're just spouting this just because metapolitics, right? This idea that supposedly you can proselytize any individual to any ideological motive just so they can wear it like, you know, hot topic fashion. And it's hilarious
Right.
because these same problems I saw in right wing culture is now happening in a very, very small sector of left wing culture. And
Hmm.
it ultimately makes me think whether or not that these kind of divides between left and right is kind of just it's just a dichotomy to just people. Like if you're more altruistic and more guilt shaming or guilt, you would go be left wing. And supposedly if you're more I don't care, anti SJW, you're somehow now right wing. And none of
That's what I'm
these two
saying. It's very,
groups.
very complex. So when we talk about things like, when we try to talk about this thing, it is extremely complex because you have so many different factions, and a lot of it is people just being offended. So therefore, they brand you a certain way automatically. For example, the easiest one is to just say that if all right people support Donald fucking Trump. And that's hilarious because if you go on 4chan, you'll see tons of people just like they hate fucking Trump. And me personally, I definitely don't give a fuck about any form of politics. So I'm not going to be latching on to that form of identity whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
But what is your more like? Where do you come from at this point? That's kind of like what I'm trying to get at, because it is kind of complex to talk about.
I mean, if we're talking on the internet right now, it's like understanding most normative people do not care about casual, fun talks about political science stuff. I mean, Keith
Right.
Preston, who does attackthesystem.org, his whole career is having fun and talking about analytical categories about political science, whether it's about national anarchism or green feminism. I've always been a fan of Creef Preston since the days of Voice of Reason Radio Network. But one thing I've noticed is that on the internet, post 2015, you can make up any ideology you want, and then people sincerely will subscribe to it. Like I've said, brony white nationalism. And then so as long as that has a platform, I guess you can create something from it. And this, ironically, is very similar to the creation of Vaporwave or Witch House or
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
and these were all just memes. They weren't like sincere cultural things happening in LA. These were just things made up on the internet where people put them together. And then through the influence of the internet, people do these things inactive, in person. But I also think that, because we can paint ideologies, we can also fix them like a car to anything we want. We could say, well, I'm an anti-capitalist, but I want a communal system like Murray Bookchin's advocating. And then you have a dividing in-war faction because other people are subscribing to Murray Rothbard's version of anti-egalitarianism or something. And so you do have that diversity there. But I think through all this kind of autism and division, at the end of the day, there's like actual cultures that are happening outside, besides the internet, besides what we're talking about right now, that the normative person is being under the influence. One thing that, examining is that I can definitely say that we're living under an Asian influenced Eurasianist society, that all kind of the lowbrow arts, cartoons, the way we think about things, the way romance, intimacy, and sexuality is presented is through an Asiatic lens. Everything seems to be influenced from
Well,
anime.
that's where, see, that's another irony too here, is that I agree with what you're saying 100%. And the irony is that
that's real.
a lot
That's
of
what I'm
guys,
basically saying. It's not like some
it
guy.
is real. It is real, and I agree. It's backed up by facts, and it was said by Oswald Spengler, who, ironically enough, is the guy a lot of alt-right dudes flock to for historical stuff. And I read the book, and it is a good fucking book. It's called Decline of the West, and it gets into everything. And you're right. The future is going towards East Asia and Eurasia, 100%. That's where all the markets are going. And the West is declining, and it's going to decline more. And there's going to be set up a new union in the Far East eventually, and people will immigrate there, and a lot of white people will end up going there as well.
So I mean, it's already happening if you're a jet student going to Japan or South Korea or Taiwan,
But
and just
yes,
having promiscuous sex culture over there, or sex tourism, or
right, yeah, all that.
any type of decadent, degenerate, westernized, Larry Clark-esque thing, and then you put it into the context of East. Well, most smart Northeast Asians and Southeast Asians understand that's a colonial attack. Even some of the elite boomer, even Gen X academics who subscribe to colonialism, cultural colonialism or whatnot, can also see that. And there's a little irony there because globalism advocates this soft consumer takeover by whitewashing everything, and while at the same time leaving in values of universal egalitarianism and neoliberal enlightenment. That simply isn't a form of communism, but it's this brash co-opt capitalism to make people happy, socially controlled and whatnot, but at the same time secretly whitewashing things under this guise to have it. And this byproduct will be Eurasianism, as that's kind of a true fact that's happening. And so that's kind of that's besides this kind of autistic internet area of like Keith Preston and categorizing politics, and it's happening in person whenever you bring up kind of these truthful things like decadence and downfall. Most people will be angry about that because most people would rather live in a fantasy than hear the truth, because I think most people don't have answers, and I think most people are becoming more of these decadent nihilists than ever. I think people would rather
Well,
just
yes,
live their life
100%.
and die than actually be partners or paternal forces, because like a game of hot potato, they would rather give some strong person that. But then that just goes to show you through social Darwinian effects, well, then if you don't have this certain group of people, one will get cuckolded and this other will survive, and those values will win out, and one history will be erased through something else. And that's, I think, is from my own study in critical theory and from my own clever observations, especially in the arts, I think that's happening. If you want to ask anything ideologically I'm sincere about, sometimes I facetiously say, oh yes, I'm a Eurasianist, or something like that. I guess the autistic part would be, how can you make a punk rock version of that, right? We're talking about like Boyd Rice. How can you make
Yeah.
like, and that's what I originally joked Val Stankert about 4 or 5 years ago, is I said, what do we make of this Eurasianism happening? And it's like, yeah, it's a form of Asianarianism. And what was something as a joke really just pisses people off when they hear the word Aryanism. And sometimes I always like to think of myself, damn, I should have just called it Eurasianism, but I didn't want people to be confused like it was like Alexander Dugin or something like that. But I just went along with it. It was just like this whole Jim Goad in your face type of personality. But I don't know, if it works, it works. I just say AXA now, or Eurasianist.
Well, I mean, the fact here is that you're right. The decline of the West is a real thing. It's been happening over the past 100 years. And what really started it was cultural Marxism with an influx of identity culture, plus the internet, plus making a fucking YouTube account and identifying more with an online username than your own government real name. All these things, pretending to be this or that, wanting to be this or that, putting on this image or that image, all these things, it's in the grand scheme of things, it is a decline basically from an oligarchy to, there was no term for cultural Marxists back in Plato's day, so the most you could call it would be democracy. And that's ruled by the people, and that's what we see now is ruled by the motherfucking people, but the people don't know how to rule, and eventually the whole thing's going to fucking crash, and then the next society will be East Asia predominantly, or Eurasia, both. Russia will probably still have a chance in the future, probably a big one, and I think most of the white people will go to Russia.
I mean, there's a lot to think about in geography. Again,
Yeah.
I'm still doing my own kind of thing at the moment. I mean, right now I'm going to be publishing something more on art and more social. I mean, I really love Peter Sotos. And so my next book will be something on the lines of Peter Sotos and music. But if I do return to the Eurasianist topic, which will likely be soon, it's going to be more of personal stories and anecdotes and, kind of empirical evidence of seeing things. You could be hypothetical, which I used to be of imagining a futuristic utopian society. But it shows you that most poets and artists in the past of envisioning just live in the present and embrace the present, and then 5 steps ahead or 3 steps ahead into what that future will be. I mean, the state of Israel was all planned and talked about, but the embracement of some kind of Jewish nationalism was just talked about in the present before the state of Israel was established. And so just like socialism and communism comes kind of the same way. You just have to talk about that kind of Eurasianist future in the present, and then eventually 30 years along down the line, when we have white male, Asian female, Asian male, white male, or Eurasian coupling, and those children will grow up in their late 20s, 20 or 30 years by now, they will have that collective and they will have that nostalgia, and things will start to click. But right now, it's this awkward transition theory where I believe capitalism is failing, and a lot of the boomer ethos of the past 70
Well,
years
yeah.
is really dying. So,
Well, yes, I agree 100%. See, the thing is, and I'm not anti-capitalist. I think capitalism it's a decent model to try to carve your own way into life. But the thing is, everything has a push and pull because capitalism actually creates, like it is literally a scale, and it always happens. It's an economic scale in which all societies go through. And capitalism is one of the stages, because what is capitalism? Capitalism is saying, well, I'm going to be a businessman. I'm going to call it fucking Google. It's not a real word, but we're going to pretend it is a real word, and then it becomes a word. And that's basically someone imagining an imaginary idea that doesn't have any definition. What is Google? Googleplex. But then you just take that identity and it becomes a real thing. It's a real entity. And that's basically capitalism as a form of identitarianism or identity politics. It leads to it. It all goes in a cycle. Everything breaks down and then starts all over again.
Hmm. Well, again, I just mean it. My criticism of capitalism is just on the notion that capitalism is an old operating system. Capitalism does work to an extent. You just have to have extreme regulations and kind of reform ideology on it. I just think
Right.
that on the large scale of things, it's inappropriate to assume capitalism should make the world go round. And for any concept of the good life in Aristotle's terms, I think people are more better off owning the means of production or in worker cooperative states or being left to their own interests. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
also very critical on the idea of a nuclear family. I mean, again, I'm borrowing this from David Brooks' thing about the nuclear family being a mistake, as in that the nuclear family previous, after the extended or forged family kind of became a historical thing in the American Western context and the creation of what we know as kind of white, middle class, bourgeois taste of things. In other words, the creation of the stuff white people class, the creation of that if you do have a child, you must surrender and buy a house in Canton, Ohio, and go in debt for more than $1 million. These kind of old-fashioned fuddy-duddy type of white Americana ideals, which I believe was economically fueled and created as a byproduct through capitalism, and being in denial to our organic natures of being human beings with extended families, and that ultimately I believe the government should pay for the existence of a child up until he's 8 or 10. I think that children should not be anchors for families, and the reason why there's so much low birth rate is that a child is a privilege. That having a child is a privilege, but yet at the same time, ironically, a biological incentive. So we must have children, but our system is not treating children like that, but instead treating children like buying sports cars, which is really, I believe, messed up. And ultimately, I think it's a byproduct of the nuclear family and has to be abolished.
Yeah, well, I would like to comment on more of the capitalism stuff that leads to everything. See, I love capitalism actually, but it's destined to fail though because basically everything comes down to a game. It's a game of resources at the end of the day. It's a game of motherfucking resources. So the resources don't go on forever. People can continue to have as many kids as they want that they don't take care of, but that's just going to lead to more people fighting for resources, and the world is going to get chaotic. So eventually the whole thing does crash, and usually it gets ugly, usually through warfare, world wars, and that might precipitate the immigration to your Asia. But that's what I've been mulling over in my head the past few weeks. I would say it's basically the idea that it is a game of resources. It's a game of the haves and the have-nots. And I've been researching things like trying to look at the motifs and symbols of popular movies and like stuff like what is it? What's that cool movie? I don't know. I can't even remember the name, but cool. There are many movies in which it basically portrays society breaking down into some kind of fallout situation, and that's a real fucking possibility. Especially when you get plague, disease, world war. That could just be a possibility in which, before things are finally resolved, it has to go through.
Mm. No, I always think to myself that, in Asian countries, especially like China, China has accelerated because of capitalism. And you could actually argue and say what's holding capitalism together is China alone. that capitalism now is hardly not existing in the West, but China just uses capitalism or communism to their own
Well, yeah, it is.
national interest.
Americans don't produce anything anymore. That's why.
Yeah, and that's the funny part. And there's a level of irony where it's like, I understand anybody would be a proponent for capitalism in this age, because a proponent for capitalism means proponent for the Chinese people. And that means
Hmm.
creating futuristic societies like Hong Kong or whatever that they're producing. Because again, China is probably the only place where you could get odd and strange anti-copyright laws, anywhere. One thing I've always thought, which was funny, was that in, America and the West, there's so much on academia about plagiarism that it's considered an academic shaming crime to plagiarize someone, or that there should be copyright laws in America in the arts. You can't sample someone else's music without being sued or doing this. But in China, in the context there, they don't believe that. It's a Western category of the mind, and China's probably the only place where they can make clone products and clone art and sell the music or have access to it better than what you could have in America. So in a way, the Chinese, are skeptic about westernized view of things. It is a Western value to respect someone's work of art. It's also a Western value to, uh, yeah, that's what I was saying. Respect someone's art, or to, they have to earn the right to make it, and we have to have academic originality and credibility. Yet at the same time, through the Chinese, it's all about getting work done and to get, and so I think that that maybe is something in our day and age where there's too many people, 350 million people in America. How can you treat every single individual in America a unique individual? To that mathematics standards, everyone is hypothetically a clone, or a clone of one another, or copying someone else. And that's
Right.
another
I
reason
agree with
why
that.
we're becoming Asianic too. You might have, it's the typical, to borrow this liberal culture of being original and then dyeing your hair blue and getting a nose ring. It's this kind of silliness that's collective, but people believe they're individuals. I think that is something the West made up and now is reaping the consequences, because you can only have that in a commune of less than 2,000 people or something, or like that. But then when you put it on a large scale thing, then people just copy one another, and there's regional sects of cultures that don't make any sense whatsoever, and it's quite antithetical to any progressive notion, and therefore you might as well just copy and paste people's work of art at that point in time. But no, that's just a little digression. If you want my commentary on that.
Well, yeah, that's what happens. Yeah, and I do agree, by the way, that there are very, very, very few actually original people out there. Most people are copycats, clones. They just monkey see, monkey do. They follow the herd. Most people have a herd instinct. Very rarely will you actually meet someone who you could call a genuine individual. Very rarely will you come across that, because most people just tend to follow whatever is given to them on a silver platter and not really question it. So if they're promoting something in the mainstream, most people would just swallow it all up without really thinking things through. But the only thing is that I do agree. If you make art, you should get some kind of recompense or royalty for it, because it entices the artist to continue making the work, and you should get credit for what you do. I do believe that.
Hmm. No, it's a lot to think about. Yeah. Just a little side note. Speaking of Oswald Spengler, the first time I've actually looked into Oswald Spengler was more than a decade ago by this guy named John David Ebert. And he was the only YouTuber to talk about Oswald Spengler. But again, I tried to understand Decline of the West literally 8 years ago, but I never even got past the introduction. And
It's a dense book. It's very dense. Yeah.
yeah, David Ebert tried to explain it in his YouTube videos, but to this day, John David Ebert, he still is active and he still talks about philosophy and whatnot. But I always thought he was a very nutty, eccentric individual, and I just think it's funny because Ebert once tried to make a Oswald Spengler society And I think I remember on his little website he wrote, it has nothing to do with the far right or racist types trying to co-opt Spengler or something, which I scratched my head and I thought to myself, well, that's kind of inevitable, because if Spengler's talking about the decline of the West, the type of individual that wants to save the West or at least resurrect it or something like that is going to have values which you might consider racist. But I don't know. I think that project failed on Ebert's behalf. And he just goes now on YouTube just ranting about philosophy. And oh, yeah, I found the video. It's 8 years ago. The video was uploaded.
Probably in his case. I can only say that the thing about the decline of the West is that it's a fucking masterpiece of a book if you can actually get through the whole thing. And basically all it really is, it's a Western regurgitation. I don't mean that regurgitation in a negative way. It's basically carrying on Plato, basically saying what Plato is saying, but you can't say what Plato said unless you have the linguistic techniques in which to say it in the modern culture. So you have to redefine things. But essentially, he's basically parroting Plato, and Plato knew his fucking shit about things. So he really did, and he would probably be saying exactly what I'm saying right here, right now. So the interesting thing about what do you call it? The Decline of the West is often considered a fucking alt-right book, or at least many. It inspires alt-right movements or whatever. But that's another reason I don't identify with any fucking politics, because if you view things in such categorical ways, you'll never be able to see what actually is being said, because your mind will say, well, that's fucking all right. That's all right. And then you'll reject it. So you won't even get into what's being said about it. But if you sit back and view things from an objective point of mind, take things from the left, the right, wherever, Islamic literature, whatever the fucking literature is, everything has some value, I believe. I do believe. Now, of course, there's a pecking order of things, but that doesn't mean you can just throw the baby with the fucking bathwater on, you baby out with the bathwater on everything. There is something to be learned. And also, people often categorize things. That happens a lot. It, Oswald Spengler, did he really want to fucking start like some kind of alt-right movement? He wasn't even thinking in terms of that. He was thinking from a philosopher standpoint, like what's actually going on here when we study economics, when we study history. What is the recurring theme here? Why do nations, and not just nations, but giant geographical areas, why do they tend to go through the same exact tumultuous conclusions, often fucking violent and bloody conclusions, but conclusions nonetheless? Then the whole thing starts all over again. But usually you'll have like 1,000 periods in between. That's why Europe had their dark ages. It seems like we're going back, and America's going to get a fucking first dark age. And I don't say that proudly, because like if things could get fucking crazy, who knows really how badly things could get before the immigration to the east gets. But if you're smart, you would fucking just immigrate there before any of the bad shit happen, I suppose.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, my recent reading, I've been, as interesting philosophy is, I've kind of been more into art journalism and art criticism. And, types like Oswald Spengler and Carl Schmitt, I might have found interesting a decade ago, which I don't think I've had. I think I have Spengler in my library, but things like that and kind of interesting classical, reactionary literature I always found fascinating. But I've kind of now moved on to interesting crit theory and theory of design. I find
Like what if you don't mind me asking, what
well, I was about to
are
say
you?
Dick Hebdige. I mean, I've been recently reading Subcultures by Dick Hebdige, or um, I'm actually looking at my library at this instant because I want to be as honest as possible what I've actually been looking up. But for example, Dick Hebdige, Subcultures, I find that as an important book about what gentrification is, how has capitalism made us into units of consumer, how there's fake and subcultures of the authentic and inauthentic, kind of using Heideggerian language in some way or another. But I also am really enjoying hybrid cultures. I've read the first chapter to that. Oh yeah, Canzellini, and just kind of taking my time on these things and applying it. I mean, if you want to be more honest, I've just pretty much am just having my own fun interest reading the work of Frederick Jameson back and forth in his first book about postmodernism. And that's kind of what I've been really into at the moment.
You basically have to get to a point where you're honest enough to admit that things are what they are, people are what they are. People often adopt political personas, identities for reasons in which would preserve their genes from from an evolutionary biology standpoint. Everyone's wants to survive. Who really? I mean, even the theory of suicide is interesting because I don't think it's just as simple as people think it is. But that's a whole other discussion that we don't need to really get into because that could detract a little bit from the conversation. But basically, what I'm saying is you need to get to a point where you just let things happen as they ultimately will, and they ultimately will happen in a specific way. Things go in a certain direction. There are laws of nature, and no one is exempt from these fucking laws. And that's why in the past, in ancient cultures, they used to personify the earth like Mother Gaia. They is the name for uh, the earth in the Greco-Roman religions. They used to personify things like that. They used to personify the moon. Basically, nature goes in cycles, and it even happens with ice ages, uh, ozone layer, oxygen amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, which always changes. There used to be a lot more oxygen and chemicals in the atmosphere, but that is not the case anymore. There's no longer an ice age. So sometimes things go down, then they heat up. My point is it mirrors human society because humans aren't on an island isolated from nature. We're within nature. We may create our utopias or quote unquote utopias, but we're not, we still cannot escape nature. That will never happen. So things are going to play out as they will. The most you can do is basically sit back, be honest about what you are, who you are, and ultimately what you want, which is to survive. Essentially, everyone wants to survive, and things will often not be, even the worst that could possibly happen isn't going to be that bad. You just need to get in a point where you look at things from a purely objective standpoint in which allows you to survive anything. So that is where people need to be. They're too much in reactionary mindsets. They're too much, oh, he's a Trump supporter, or oh, Hillary supporter. Come on, that's masses mentality. People, the masses are going to be the masses. You can't really wake people up. I've learned that as well. So that's what I'm saying. You need to just let people be as they will and look out for yourself and your group. And it's good to have a set of values instead of just being like a selfish fucking pig. You know, just that's the one thing the communists got right about the capitalists is that the capitalists they have no fucking values because often in order to gain recognition or prestige, and this is where aristocracy comes from, in order to gain these things, it needs to be in the right element. It can't be from profit seeking mentality, profit for the sake of profit. That's you're someone who can be bought and sold. If all you care about is profit for the sake of profit and you have no other value, you're basically saying you can be bought and sold and shipped and put anywhere and it wouldn't bother you. So that's certainly what the communists get correct about the capitalist culture, and we are. And I'm not one of these guys that just was going to sit here and defend capitalism, because everything has a lot of flaws. Capitalism certainly does. One of the benefits, however, is that it does allow you to be industrious. It allows room for that. But when the competition gets a little too crazy, when the competition gets a little too tense, and the resources become a little more scarce, that's when capitalism breaks down, because eventually things will get bought out by bigger, stronger entities or forces. That's just the way it will go. So population will get to some manageable level. It will happen. It will happen either through forces of nature, Mother Nature's sending hurricanes, tornado. There's going to be a lot of that. Basically what my point is you can't really view all these things in isolated mindsets. You need to see these things through mindsets in which one begets the other. There's a correlation of causality here. One thing is causing this, which is causing that, which is causing this. But in the West, we have a different strategy. We tend not to look at things like that. We tend to look at things like, um, don't get to the root of the cancer, just treat the symptoms. That's not a good way to look at things, because the cancer's still going to be there. It's still going to proliferate. So that's where most people are, and that's where a capitalist mentality, or what a capitalist mentality begets in its dirty form. So we're basically seeing, that is exactly what we're seeing, and especially with the coronavirus, it's where we're going down that road. We'll see if it can be some level of manageable capitalism, like you were talking about. I know quite a few things about, what do they call it? Uh, not instructive capitalism, something like, inclusive capitalism. Yes, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. This is the opportunity to see how that can work, essentially. Um, that's pretty much the best option, if you're optimistic, you could hope for. The worst is total anarchy. It may get there ultimately, but hopefully we can stave it off so it doesn't get so bad, because people really need to look at what's at stake here. And what's at stake is total collapse, heathenism, barbarism, all these things. It's like the movies are preparing you mentally for what's going for the inevitable, like all these zombie movies, or society breaking down movies, like Fallout type scenarios. It's like one of my favorite movies, actually. I don't have a mainstream sense of humor, but I do like the film This Is the End. It's fucking hilarious. And one of the it's just funny, because like a lot of those movies, perhaps they're trying to prepare you mentally for the inevitable.
Mm.